this 1907 photo of Newlyweds, the groom's hand reveals a chilling detail. The afternoon light filtered through the tall windows of Clara Bennett's workshop in Boston's North End, casting golden streaks across the dozens of antique photographs scattered on her restoration table. At 42, Clara had spent nearly 2 decades breathing new life into faded memories, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to find on this ordinary Tuesday in November 2024. She'd purchased the lot at an estate auction in Beacon Hill 3 days earlier, a dusty cardboard box containing approximately 70 photographs from the early 1900s. Most were unremarkable: family portraits, children in Sunday clothes, stoic faces staring into primitive cameras. Clara worked methodically, cataloging each image, noting dates when possible, searching for names written on the backs in spidery cursive. Then she picked up photograph number 43. It showed a wedding couple standing before a modest wooden church, probably somewhere in rural Massachusetts. The bride wore a simple white dress with lace sleeves, her dark hair pulled back beneath a small veil. Her expression was radiant, almost luminous with joy. The groom stood beside her in a dark suit, one hand resting on her shoulder, the other hanging at his side. They looked to be in their mid-20s. On the back, someone had written in faded ink, "Thomas and Eleanor, June 15, 1907. Clara placed the photograph on her scanner, a high-resolution device capable of capturing details invisible to the naked eye. As the machine hummed to life, she sipped her coffee and glanced at the autumn rain beginning to tap against the windows. She'd scan this image, restore any damage, and add it to her online archive where descendants might someday find their ancestors. The scan completed with a soft beep. Clara pulled up the digital file on her monitor and began her usual process, adjusting contrast, removing spots and creases, carefully bringing the image back to its original clarity. She zoomed in on the couple's faces first, as she always did, studying their expressions, imagining their stories. But when she panned down to examine the groom's hands for any restoration needs, her breath caught in her throat. There, on the back of his left hand, clearly visible in the enhanced image, was a scar. Not just any scar, a deliberate mark burned into the skin in the unmistakable shape of an X. Clara's hands trembled as she zoomed in further. The mark was approximately 2 inches across, the tissue raised and discolored even in the sepia tones of the old photograph. She'd seen marks like this before, during a research project years ago about early American criminal justice systems. In the early 20th century, certain states branded repeat offenders and escaped convicts with identifying marks. An X on the hand meant one thing: this man was a fugitive. Clara stared at the screen for several minutes, her mind racing. The groom, Thomas, stood there looking so ordinary, so innocently happy beside his bride. Yet that mark on his hand told a very different story. She took a screenshot of the enhanced scar and opened her laptop, fingers flying across the keyboard. Her first search was for branding practices in early 1900s Massachusetts. The results were limited but disturbing. The practice had been largely discontinued by 1907, replaced by fingerprinting and photographic records, but it had existed in various forms throughout the late 1800s. Some states had used it to mark horse thieves, murderers, and those who repeatedly escaped from prison or labor camps. The X specifically indicated an escape risk, someone who'd fled custody at least once before. Clara returned to the photograph. She studied Thomas's face more carefully now, looking for anything that might reveal his true nature. He appeared calm, almost serene. His hand rested gently on Eleanor's shoulder, protective rather than possessive. His eyes held a sadness that Clara hadn't noticed before, a weight that seemed at odds with what should have been the happiest day of his life. She flipped the original photograph over again, examining the handwriting. Thomas and Eleanor, June 15, 1907. No last name. No location beyond what she could infer from the church's architecture and the landscape visible in the background. Decidedly New England, probably within 50 miles of Boston. Clara pulled out her phone and called her friend Marcus. a genealogist who specialized in Massachusetts records. He answered on the third ring, his cheerful voice cutting through her growing unease. "Clara, haven't heard from you in weeks. What's up?" "Marcus, I need your help. I've got a wedding photo from 1907. Couple named Thomas and Eleanor, married June 15th. No last name, but I think it's somewhere in Massachusetts, possibly closer to Boston. Can you search marriage records?" "Sure, but that's not much to go on. Do you have anything else? Physical descriptions? Church name?" Clara zoomed in on the church visible behind the couple. The building was small, white clapboard with a simple cross above the door. Nothing distinctive. "Not really, but Marcus, there's something else. The groom has a brand mark on his hand, an X, the kind they used for escaped prisoners." The line went silent for a moment. When Marcus spoke again, his voice had lost its casual warmth. "You're serious?" "Completely. I've enhanced the image. It's definitely a brand scar." "That changes things. If he was a fugitive, there might be police records, wanted posters, newspaper articles. This isn't just genealogy anymore. It's a criminal investigation, a really old one." 2 days later, Clara found herself in the basement archives of the Boston Public Library, surrounded by leather-bound volumes of old newspapers and city records. Marcus sat across from her, his reading glasses perched on his nose as he carefully turned the yellowed pages of a marriage registry from 1907. "Here," he said suddenly, his finger stopping on a line of faded handwriting. "Thomas and Eleanor Hartwell, married June 15, 1907, at St. Michael's Church in Roxbury. Witnesses, Samuel Porter and Catherine Morrison. The groom's occupation is listed as carpenter, the bride's as seamstress." "Hartwell," Clara repeated, writing the name in her notebook. "So they were married in Roxbury. That's not far from here." Marcus was already pulling out his laptop, fingers moving across the keys. "Let me search for any other records associated with those names. Census data, property records, anything that might tell us what happened to them." While Marcus worked, Clara turned to the newspaper archives. She started with the Boston Globe from June 1907, scanning through society pages and local news. Weddings were sometimes announced, especially in smaller communities like Roxbury had been at the time. She found nothing about Thomas and Eleanor's wedding, but that wasn't unusual. Most ordinary marriages went unrecorded in newspapers unless the families were prominent. She moved forward in time, month by month, looking for any mention of the Hartwell name. July passed with nothing. August brought only a brief classified advertisement for carpentry services offered by a T. Hartwell on Warren Street. September was blank. Then, in October 1907, she found it. The headline was small, tucked in the lower corner of page 7. "Local man vanishes, wife appeals for information." Clara's hands shook as she read. "Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, 24 of Roxbury, has appealed to police for assistance in locating her husband, Thomas Hartwell, 26, who disappeared from their home on September 12th without explanation. Mrs. Hartwell states that her husband left for work that morning and never returned. He took no belongings and left no note. Anyone with information is asked to contact the Roxbury police station." "Marcus, look at this." He came around the table and read over her shoulder. 3 months after the wedding, what do you think happened?" "I don't know, but we need to find out if there are any police records from the investigation." Clara photographed the article with her phone, her mind already racing ahead. "And we need to know who Thomas really was before he became Thomas Hartwell." The Massachusetts State Archives in Dorchester were less welcoming than the library. The building was modern and sterile, with fluorescent lights that hummed overhead as Clara and Marcus waited in the research room. After filling out multiple request forms, they finally received 3 slim folders containing police records from Roxbury, dated 1907. The case file on Thomas Hartwell's disappearance was frustratingly thin. The initial report, filed by Eleanor on September 14, 1907, contained little more than the information published in the newspaper. The investigating officer, Detective James O'Connor, had interviewed neighbors and Thomas's employer at the carpentry shop where he worked. The notes revealed that Thomas had been described as quiet and hard-working, kept to himself, never spoke of family or past. His employer stated that Thomas had arrived for work on September 12th, but left at midday, claiming he felt unwell. He never returned. Most telling were the detective's final notes, dated October 3, 1907. Investigation suspended. No evidence of foul play. Subject likely left of own volition. Wife continues to maintain husband would not abandon her voluntarily. Case remains open but inactive. They gave up on him, Marcus said quietly. They assumed he just ran away. Clara was examining another document in the file, a physical description of Thomas Hartwell provided by Eleanor. Height approximately 5 feet 10 inches, brown hair, blue eyes, slender build, has distinctive scar on back of left hand. She'd mentioned the scar. Eleanor had known about it. Marcus, we need to find criminal records. If Thomas was branded, there has to be a record somewhere of his original crime and imprisonment. That search proved more difficult. Branding had been inconsistently documented, and many records from the late 1800s had been lost or destroyed. They spent hours scrolling through digitized prison records from Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island, looking for any mention of an ex-brand or an escaped prisoner who might match Thomas's description. Finally, in a ledger from the Massachusetts State Prison in Charlestown, dated 1903, Clara found an entry that made her breath catch. Prisoner 3847, Michael Garrett, age 22, convicted of manslaughter, sentenced to 15 years hard labor, escaped during transport, September 1903. Branded with escape mark prior to transport, considered dangerous. The physical description matched Thomas Hartwell exactly, right down to the scar on his left hand, though the entry specified it had been deliberately added as punishment and identification. Michael Garrett, Marcus whispered. That's who Thomas really was. Clara's obsession with the case deepened over the following weeks. She spent her evenings researching Michael Garrett, piecing together fragments of his story from old court records and newspaper articles. What she discovered was both tragic and disturbing. In July 1902, Michael Garrett had been a 21-year-old factory worker in Lawrence, Massachusetts, living in a cramped boarding house with other immigrant laborers. One night, a fight had broken out in a local tavern. According to trial transcripts, Garrett had intervened when a drunk man was beating a woman in the alley behind the bar. The confrontation had turned violent. The drunk man, later identified as Harold Brennan, a foreman at the same factory where Garrett worked, had pulled a knife. In the struggle, Brennan had died from a stab wound to the chest. Witnesses testified that Garrett had been defending the woman, but the victim's family was influential. The prosecution painted Garrett as a troublemaker, a foreign-born agitator prone to violence. The jury convicted him of manslaughter, and the judge sentenced him to 15 years in state prison. The newspaper coverage was brutal. The Lawrence Tribune described Garrett as a menace to civilized society and praised the verdict as justice served. No one mentioned the woman he'd tried to protect. In September 1903, while being transported from Lawrence to the state prison in Charlestown, Garrett had escaped. The transport wagon had broken a wheel on a rural road, and in the confusion, he'd slipped his restraints and fled into the woods. Before the transport, he'd been branded with the X on his hand, a standard practice for prisoners considered escape risks. After that, Michael Garrett had vanished completely from official records until he reappeared 4 years later as Thomas Hartwell, marrying Eleanor in a small church in Roxbury. Clara sat in her workshop late one evening, the wedding photograph displayed on her monitor. She looked at Thomas's, Michael's, face with new understanding. The sadness in his eyes made sense now. He'd been living a lie, hiding his true identity, knowing that discovery could mean imprisonment or worse. But why had he run? What had happened on September 12, 1907, 3 months after his wedding? The answer, Clara suspected, lay not in police records or newspaper archives, but in Eleanor's own story, a story that seemed to have ended in silence and sorrow. Finding information about Eleanor proved surprisingly difficult. After Thomas's disappearance, she seemed to have faded from public record. Marcus finally located her in the 1910 census, living alone in the same Roxbury apartment she'd shared with her husband, still listed as seamstress for occupation. still using the name Eleanor Hartwell despite her husband's absence. But it was a newspaper article from 1935 that revealed the depth of Eleanor's devotion and her heartbreak. The Boston Herald had published a human interest story titled, "Woman's 28-Year Search for Vanished Husband Ends in Death." Clara read it with tears in her eyes. The article described how Eleanor Hartwell, then 62 years old, had spent nearly 3 decades searching for information about her missing husband. She'd never remarried, never given up hope that Thomas was alive somewhere. She'd spent her modest savings hiring private investigators, placing advertisements in newspapers across the country, writing to police departments and prisons. She died in Massachusetts General Hospital in March 1935, still wearing her wedding ring, still clutching a small photograph of her and Thomas on their wedding day. The article included a quote from Eleanor's neighbor, a woman named Dorothy Chen. She never stopped loving him. She told me once that she knew something terrible must have happened to him because he never would have left her willingly. She said he was the kindest man she'd ever known, that he'd saved her from a terrible situation, and that she'd spent her whole life trying to find him. Clara read that line again. He'd saved her from a terrible situation. A terrible situation. Could it be connected to why Michael Garrett had been imprisoned in the first place? He'd intervened to protect a woman in Lawrence. Had he somehow encountered Eleanor in similar circumstances? Marcus arrived at the workshop that evening with a folder full of new documents. I found Eleanor's death certificate and her will. She left everything to St. Michael's Church in Roxbury, the church where she and Thomas were married. But there's something else. He pulled out a photocopy of a handwritten letter, yellowed with age. This was attached to her will, marked to be opened only after her death. The church kept it in their archives. I had to get special permission to see it. Clara took the letter carefully. The handwriting was shaky but legible, written by an elderly hand. To whoever reads this, my husband Thomas was not who the world thought he was, but he was good and kind, and he gave up everything to keep me safe. If you are reading this, I am gone, and he is too. But I want someone to know the truth. His real name was Michael, and he was a hero. Eleanor's letter didn't provide all the answers, but it opened a new avenue of investigation. If Eleanor had known Michael's real identity, she might have left other clues: diaries, letters, documents hidden away. Clara contacted St. Michael's Church in Roxbury, which still stood, though now surrounded by modern development. Father O'Brien, the current pastor, was intrigued by Clara's story. He led her and Marcus through the church's basement, past shelves of dusty records and boxes of donated items. When Mrs. Hartwell died, she left us a small trunk of personal belongings along with her bequest. We've kept it all these years, but no one's ever opened it. I suppose we were waiting for the right person. The trunk was small, made of worn leather with tarnished brass fittings. Inside, Clara found carefully preserved treasures: Eleanor's wedding veil, a bundle of letters tied with ribbon, a small Bible with pressed flowers between its pages, and at the bottom, wrapped in cloth, a leather journal. Clara opened the journal with trembling hands. The entries began in June 1907, just after Eleanor's wedding, written in the same elegant handwriting as the letter attached to her will. June 16, 1907. I am married to the most wonderful man in the world. I know his secret, and I love him more for it, not less. He told me everything last night: his real name, what happened in Lawrence, why he ran. He wanted me to know the truth before we wed, wanted to give me the chance to walk away, but I could never walk away from him. He saved me from Harold Brennan's brother, just as he once tried to save another woman from Harold himself. Clara's eyes widened. Harold Brennan, the man Michael Garrett had killed in self-defense in 1902, had a brother. She flipped through the pages, her heart pounding. Eleanor had documented everything: how she'd met Thomas in early 1907 when he'd intervened to stop a man named Robert Brennan from harassing her outside the factory where she worked. How Thomas had recognized Brennan's name and realized that Robert was the brother of the man he'd killed 5 years earlier. How they'd fallen in love despite the danger. The entries continued through the summer, chronicling their quiet happiness. But in early September, The tone changed dramatically. September 10th, 1907. Thomas came home tonight terribly shaken. Robert Brennan saw the scar on his hand today at the market. Thomas said Brennan's eyes lit up with recognition. He knows. He's figured out who Thomas really is. Thomas says Brennan has been asking questions around the neighborhood, digging into our past. 2 days later, the final entry. September 12th, 1907. Thomas kissed me goodbye this morning and told me he loved me. He said he had to leave, that Brennan was going to the police, that if he stayed they would arrest him and I would be implicated for harboring a fugitive. He said he couldn't let me suffer for his past. I begged him to stay, but he said this was the only way to protect me. He's gone, and I don't know if I'll ever see him again. Armed with Eleanor's journal, Clara now understood why Michael Garrett had disappeared. He'd fled to protect his wife from being charged as an accomplice. But where had he gone? Eleanor had searched for 28 years without finding him. What chance did Clara have of uncovering the truth more than a century later? Marcus suggested they search for records of Robert Brennan. If Brennan had reported Michael Garrett to the police, there should be documentation. They returned to the archives, this time focusing on September 1907. They found the report buried in a stack of routine police paperwork. Robert Brennan had indeed gone to the Roxbury police station on September 12, 1907, claiming he'd recognized an escaped convict named Michael Garrett living under the alias Thomas Hartwell. He'd provided the address and physical description. But here's where the story took an unexpected turn. The detective who took the report, the same James O'Connor who'd investigated Thomas's disappearance, had noted something curious. Brennan appeared intoxicated and aggressive. Claimed subject killed his brother in 1902. Checked records. Case was ruled self-defense by original court. Sentence may have been excessive. Brennan demanding immediate arrest. Advised him to return when sober. Brennan became belligerent and was removed from station. O'Connor had never arrested Michael Garrett. In fact, the detective's personal notes, included in the file, revealed his skepticism. Brennan is known to police. History of drunkenness and violence. Brother Harold Brennan died in 1902 after assaulting a woman. Garrett intervened. Sentence seems harsh given circumstances. If Garrett has been living peacefully for 4 years, is it justice to destroy his life now? We'll investigate, but not rushing to judgment. Clara felt a surge of hope. Detective O'Connor had been sympathetic. He hadn't immediately pursued Michael Garrett. But then why had Michael fled? The answer came in another document, a telegram sent from the Boston Police Department to the Roxbury station on September 15, 1907. Inform DT O'Connor that prisoner Michael Garrett case has been escalated. State Marshal Wilson taking jurisdiction. Arrest warrant issued. Subject considered dangerous and priority for apprehension. Someone higher up had overridden O'Connor's caution. Someone had decided that Michael Garrett needed to be captured immediately and returned to prison. Marcus found the name they were looking for in an old newspaper clipping. State Marshal Robert Harlan had been a political ally of the Brennan family. Robert Brennan had pulled strings, using his family's influence to force the issue. Michael Garrett hadn't just been running from the law, he'd been running from a system that was stacked against him. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Clara had posted the wedding photograph on a genealogy website, hoping distant relatives might recognize Thomas or Eleanor. 3 weeks after posting it, she received an email from a woman named Sarah Pritchard in Portland, Maine. I think the man in your photo might be my great-great-grandfather. My grandmother told me stories about him. She said his name was Michael, but everyone called him Thomas. He worked as a carpenter in Portland from around 1908 until he died in 1942. He never married, never spoke about his past, but he kept a small photograph in his pocket, a woman in a wedding dress. Could this be him? Clara's hands shook as she typed her response. Within hours, she and Marcus were on a train to Portland, the wedding photograph safely stored in Clara's bag. Sarah Pritchard was a kind-faced woman in her 50s who greeted them at the Portland train station with a folder of documents and a small wooden box. My grandmother always said there was a mystery about Michael, Sarah explained as they sat in a nearby cafe. She was his neighbor's daughter, used to bring him meals when she was a girl. She said he was the saddest man she'd ever known, that he had beautiful furniture he'd made, but lived like he was just passing through. Sarah opened the box. Inside was the photograph Michael had carried, Eleanor in her wedding dress, the same image Clara had been studying for months. Beside it was a small, worn journal. "He gave this to my grandmother before he died. Told her that if anyone ever came looking for him, to share it with them. He said someone might need to know the truth someday." Clara opened the journal with reverence. The first entry was dated September 15, 1907, written in a strong, masculine hand. "I've left Boston, left Eleanor. It's the hardest thing I've ever done, but it's the only way to keep her safe. If I'd stayed, they would have arrested me and charged her as an accomplice. She would have lost everything, her reputation, her livelihood, maybe even her freedom. I can't let that happen. I'd rather spend the rest of my life alone than see her suffer for my mistakes." The entries continued, documenting Michael's journey to Portland, his assumption of a new identity, his work as a carpenter. He wrote about Eleanor constantly, his love for her, his hope that she was living a good life, his regret that he couldn't give her the family they'd dreamed of. One entry, dated December 1935, made Clara's eyes fill with tears. "I read in the newspaper that Eleanor has died. She's gone. All these years I've stayed away to protect her, and now she's gone. They say she never stopped searching for me, never remarried. What have I done? I thought I was saving her, but maybe I only broke her heart." The final entries in Michael's journal provided the closure Clara had been seeking. In 1940, 2 years before his death, Michael had written a long, detailed account of everything that had happened. His conviction in 1902, his escape, his love for Eleanor, his decision to leave her to protect her from prosecution. He'd also written something that changed Clara's understanding of the entire story. "I want the world to know that Eleanor knew who I was. She knew about Michael Garrett, about the brand on my hand, about the crime I'd been convicted of. She knew all of it, and she chose me anyway. She didn't harbor a criminal. She loved a man who'd made a terrible mistake trying to do the right thing. The law called me a fugitive, but Eleanor called me her husband. In the eyes of God and in my heart, that's what I was. That's what I'll always be." Clara sat in her workshop on a cold December evening in 2024, the completed restoration of the wedding photograph displayed on her monitor. She'd removed the damage and discoloration, bringing Thomas and Eleanor back to life in stunning clarity. The X on Thomas's hand was visible, but now Clara understood its meaning. Not a mark of shame, but evidence of a system that had failed a good man. She'd written an extensive article documenting everything she discovered. Michael Garrett's wrongful imprisonment, his escape, his life with Eleanor, his sacrifice to protect her, and his lonely decades in Portland. The story would be published in a historical journal, ensuring that their love story wouldn't be forgotten. Marcus had helped her locate Sarah Pritchard again, and together they donated Michael's journal, Eleanor's diary, and the wedding photograph to the Massachusetts Historical Society, where they would be preserved and made available to researchers and descendants. On the anniversary of Eleanor's death, Clara and Sarah stood together in the small cemetery in Roxbury, where Eleanor was buried. They'd placed a second headstone beside hers, one they'd commissioned with Michael's real name and dates. The inscription read, "Michael Thomas Garrett, 1881-1942, beloved husband of Eleanor, separated in life, reunited in memory." As snow began to fall softly over the cemetery, Clara thought about the power of a single photograph to reveal truth, to restore justice, and to honor love that transcended circumstance and time. The brand on Michael's hand had been meant to mark him as a criminal, to ensure he'd never escape his past. Instead, it had become the key that unlocked a story of courage, sacrifice, and devotion, a story that deserved to be told, remembered, and celebrated. Thomas and Eleanor had been denied their life together, but through Clara's work, their love had finally been recognized and their truth finally revealed.